Hello, welcome. This is the Freedom Research Podcast, and my name is Hannes Sarv. My guest today is Matthew Wielicki, a geologist whose research interests also include climate change and the implications of warming on severe weather and the overall human condition. He's the former assistant professor in the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Alabama and a postdoctoral research scientist at the University of California. But now he calls himself an earth science professor in exile. So, Matthew, thank you for accepting our invitation and thank you for giving this interview.
Thank you for having me, Hannes.
So, earth science professor in exile. I checked your webpage. You really call yourself that. So, what's the story behind it?
Yeah, so I was always planning on being an academic. My father was an academic, a professor. So I grew up on a college campus. That was kind of my career path ever since I remembered being young. But I realized when I became an assistant professor at the University of Alabama that, and particularly in 2020, that things had radically changed from the college campus that I remembered my father teaching at, that I remembered running around on as a young student. It had even changed since I had started my undergraduate career and my graduate career. Things had just radically changed from what I would call a meritocracy, where we were really judging students by their academic performance, by the effort they put in, by the knowledge base that they were acquiring and the skill set that they were developing. And we were no longer judging them by that, but we tended to judge them by what I called immutable characteristics, which were things that they had no control over: their socioeconomic background, the color of their skin, their gender identity, things like that. And that just was very different than what I remembered the founding principles of an academic institution being. It was always that, it's your performance. It's how well you could retain the information, how critically you could analyze new information, the skills you could develop. It was never about the baggage you came in with, right? That's the stuff you can't really do anything about. And so when I started to speak up about these types of things, I realized that that type of attitude, and also some of my discussions about climate change, those types of ideas weren't really welcome in academia at that time period. I didn't really see a path for tenure for myself at that moment because of some of the things that I was speaking up about. And so I essentially see myself as someone that, with the ideas that I currently have, wouldn't be accepted in the modern academic institutions, particularly public institutions. And so, I'm kind of a earth science professor in exile.
Yeah, okay.
Following a little bit after Dr. Weinstein's professor in exile name that he called himself.
Yeah, exactly. But what about the universities themselves? Very important institutions, academic institutions. How does it affect the output or the outcome, the academic outcome?
Yeah, that's the most important question, right? I mean, that's ultimately what the institutions are there to do. They're there to produce research and to produce intelligent, well-rounded students that will hopefully go on to be the next leaders. And ultimately, I think that a lot of the policies and the trends that we're seeing in academia are essentially doing the opposite. They're having negative outcomes. They are isolating students. Students don't want to discuss with each other. They don't want to really mix as much as they were before. You can see that isolation in faculty as well. The collaborations have gone down. If you get taken out of context for something that you may have said, you could be labeled, whatever the derogatory term of the month is, and there's entire departments that are there to try to self-police institutions, and so there's a lot of this kind of underbelly of telling on each other. Students are encouraged to say something if they see something, and so ultimately a lot of these policies are driving students to isolate and driving faculty members to isolate. And I would argue that that's the exact opposite of what the whole intent of this is to be a more inclusive, more welcoming institutions. Well, these aren't welcoming anymore because everybody's worried that they're going to piss off the other group, and so everybody walks on eggshells. And if you're a faculty member, that means you're not honest when you're debating ideas, you're not honest when you're having discussions about policy because you're worried, and that just reduces the amount of good output, that reduces the amount of good discussions about ideas. It just essentially isolates people, and it reduces the caliber of the output that's coming out of U.S. institutions. And I think it reduces the caliber of the student. And you can see that when we look at testing and scores and things like that, that American institutions and really Western institutions in general have really started to perform less and less as they've been more focused on these, what I call immutable characteristics, things that the students don't really have any focus on. And so to me, the evidence is clear that the negative outcomes much outweigh any of the positive outcomes or the good intent. I mean, I don't blame folks for trying to have be equitable in how the academic institutions accept students. I totally understand that someone coming from a poor socioeconomic background doesn't have the same advantages as some other students. But ultimately, I don't think that the academic institutions should be in the business of modifying and somehow controlling, what the incoming classes look like, such that it appeases, what the demographic should be. I think we should be a meritocracy as an academic institution, and that's when we succeed. That's when the students succeed. They want to be respected for their academic performance. They have negative feelings when they know that they are there at an academic institutions because they're part of a quota number.
Yeah. Well, but some of it, at least, as we talked before as well, some of it at least resembles the good old Soviet Union times. I mean, telling on each other, shaming people who have maybe different ideas and so on. What's the feeling you had working in this kind of environment?
Yeah, so so I was born in the People's Republic of Poland during the Soviet era. I was very young when I immigrated, so I only know the stories and things from my parents and relatives. But I think that my radar to this type of thing is maybe a little bit more sensitive because I'm familiar with these stories. And like you said, there is just a lot of oddly similar types of things that are occurring now that occurred then. And the reason that my parents left was because they realized that wasn't a good thing. My parents wanted to come to a place where the free exchange of ideas was embraced and encouraged, and we would battle, and you could be as argumentative and you could be as passionate in your ideas and trying to disprove the other side as possible. And then you shake hands and you go out to dinner and you have a drink, and everything has changed. The idea now, especially in academia, that if you have a slight disagreement, that is somehow violence upon you. That person can no longer be a part of the department. They are a cancer that must be cut out of the department because they slightly disagree with us on this one topic. That's not academia. That's not science. That's not debate. That's essentially ideology. That's a religion. And it really did become that way, where if you speak up against these things, you have to leave. And thankfully, we're not getting thrown into the gulags at the moment. Yeah. But these little steps are the steps towards that path, and we should be talking about them now. Why can we not disagree but still be good people and still want to teach our students and still want to be positive members of the academic community? Because we disagree on this one thing, we are somehow heretics. And there is a lot of odd similarity to socialism. And I'm sorry, but it's these baby steps, but baby steps lead into big steps. And so It's oddly similar, and I wish more people were speaking about it. But oddly, it's a lot of the immigrant faculty members that are speaking and have actually emailed me the most that say, hey, we left because of this stuff, and now we see it happening again.
Yeah, yeah. But what's the acceptance level in your experience that faculty members are or have with these DEI policies and stuff like that? Are they not protesting at all, or are they for them, or?
So so the system is difficult. So, right, the young academics are at a very big disadvantage. So when you're an assistant professor, you haven't gone up for tenure, you're essentially on probation. So there's a lot of incentive to not rock the boat. You've just done your postdoc in graduate school, you've been busting your butt for a long time, and you finally landed an academic tenure track position. And so there's a lot of incentive to not rock the boat. The funding institutions, a lot of the societies were going along with the DEI stuff like crazy. There was, in fact, NSF had initiatives under the Geoscience Directorate, which is supposed to tell us how the planet works, that were completely DEI based. And so young academics would see that. So they were jumping on board a little bit, right? And they saw opportunities to get funding. Everybody would kind of speak underneath their breath after faculty meetings and things like, hey, maybe I could get this person. They're not a DEI, they're not going to work under the DEI thing, but they're like the best student I found. You think we could still get them? And so everybody kind of realized that it's a little bit of BS, but young academics were playing the game. Older academics, I think, were definitely a little bit more vocal, but the institutions themselves, the board of trustees in a lot of these places, they went along with it big time. So, the older academics could speak a little bit more because they have a little bit more protection, but everybody was staying relatively quiet because if you spoke up about it, and I was a perfect example, just a few little comments that I don't think the outcomes were having, the outcomes were not as what was intended. I was linked to anti-Semitic drawings on campus. People said that that's because I spoke out against or about some of these DEI policies, that now people are scribbling anti-Semitic things on sidewalks. This is other faculty members in the University of Alabama journalism program are linking me to these things. And so it became clear that you just can't speak about this stuff. This was taboo. This will, the university will get so much publicity, negative publicity, that you can't speak about this stuff at all.
Okay. So you mentioned that maybe senior professors, they have, a bit more freedom, but you mentioned Professor Weinstein, for example. So, I mean, no one is immune. Everybody can be targeted.
Yeah. And when these pylons begin, when these like social media pylons begin, the universities are very sensitive to their image. And when their image starts to get tainted, I'm sorry, but you're out.
Yeah. Okay. So what's your own story then? You were going to be a professor, but what did you do? Did they make you leave, or how did it happen?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I would say it's a combination of the two. So I had children just before I started my academic career. And my wife and I were pregnant again when we started at Alabama. So within the first year, I had 2 young boys. And my thought process was changing pretty rapidly at that moment. Becoming a new father, you just start to think differently. Obviously, you're just thinking in a different way that you've never thought of. I was it was a one-man ship for a long time, right? And then it was me and my wife. And now it was a whole nother story and generations down the line. And you're just thinking in a totally different way. And I started to notice that my students at the University of Alabama were very anxious. And I started to especially notice during 2020, during COVID, that they were particularly anxious about climate. Obviously, they were very anxious about COVID at the moment. But underneath all that, their number one worry was climate change. And they really were convinced that the planet was going to end in a decade or in 12 years or whatever the clock somewhere in, I think, New York on the side of a building says. And I had, female students crying to me, telling me they come from a family of 6, but, they're not going to have children. That dream is gone, and they just couldn't imagine bringing a child into a world that's going to end at some point because the planet, there's be too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and they feel too guilty to bring a child into this world. And it was heartbreaking. I mean, I couldn't believe that the field that I was in, earth science, geology, was essentially tricking young students into believing that there was a crisis. And the crisis was so big that it should be the number one thing that they think about when they're planning the rest of their life and whether or not they should have a family or not. This is the one thing they should be considering. And I just said, well, if that's true, the data should be overwhelming. And so let's take a look at this data. Let's see, is the data overwhelming that these young people really should be considering not having children? That's an enormous decision. I have a huge weight on my shoulders as being a scientist in the community that is telling these students that this is what the future looks like, that you should be making this decision. So I wanted to critically look at that data. And I did not see that the data supported this conclusion. And so I started to speak up about that. And when I started to speak up about that, that was the turning point, because speaking up about climate, so I gained a lot of traction on TikTok, I gained a lot of traction on Twitter, and now X, and that was the turning point, because having these viewpoints, there was so much public pushback. There were so many emails and calls to the chair of my department, to the president of my university, that these views were just unacceptable. The idea that an academic in the field is required to scare people, even though the data doesn't support the fact that he's scaring them, that was the final straw for me. I just said, I just can't be here. I can't be here if more of my faculty members aren't speaking out, if self-preservation of keeping my job is so important that I'm going to lie to all these young people about the state of the planet, then it's not worth it to me. And even though it was my lifelong dream, there's new avenues now. The internet is wonderful, and there's people like Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein that have shown that you can leave academia and you could have more traction. You can do more and share more information being out of academia than you ever could before, right? The path before was, I don't know, maybe I would go off and I would, maybe I would teach in elementary school or something like that. But now I can actually share more of the information that I wanted to share prior. I would write an academic paper and publish it in one of the fanciest journals around. And if I got 150 citations, that was great. But I can write one article on my Substack and it will be shared 50,000 times in a couple hours. Mm-hmm. So, if you want to actually educate people, if I want to, as an academic, I wanted to share information. That was my goal. I there's a lot of paths now to do it that are outside of academia. So I left. Yeah. But I wouldn't have been allowed to stay. Okay. So, I saw the writing on the wall, but we didn't need, I enjoyed all my colleagues. We didn't need to go through that. So, they knew I was planning on leaving and I was, and I didn't want to have a fight. I've got a lot of love for all these academic institutions. That's why I speak out against them, not because I want to destroy them. It's because I want them to survive. And I don't think they will if they keep going the way they're going.
But speaking out about climate, still back then in the university, I understand you managed to already corrupt some of your students because you really spoke about what you can observe, what are the facts, and they really started thinking, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they were refreshed to see that. I mean, you got to imagine this generation. This is like the first generation now, these young 20-year-olds. They've essentially been being told that the planet is going to end since they've been, old enough to understand and read and write. So they're like the first generation that this has been pounded into their head. It must be so just exhausting to to have been told that the planet's going to end forever. What ambition do you have to sacrifice now and to do things that will ensure a better life for your future, like getting a good education or going to the gym and eating healthy? No, the planet's going to end. Screw it. I'm just going to eat chips and play video games and wait for the planet to end, right? I mean, we're robbing them of their ambition. And so when I started to speak up about this stuff, I mean, they were so refreshed. It was like, oh my gosh, here's someone in the field, an expert in the field, who's not telling me that the planet's going to end in a decade, who's telling me my future is bright, who's telling me I should think about 30, 40, 50 years down the line. Where are my great grandkids going to be doing? You know, that's the stuff I should be thinking about because the planet's going to be just fine. They were absolutely refreshed to see that. There is a thirst for that out there. These students are tired of being told constantly that the planet's going to end. Yeah. But at the same time, I showed them that there's environmental problems. I showed them, look, here are some environmental issues. There's definitely this. I'm not trying to sweep anything under the rug, right? My goal was always to tell them, I always told them at the very beginning, you're not going to like some of the things that I'm going to show you. Some of you are going to probably hate me when you leave, but I'm not here to teach you what to think. I'm here to teach you how to think. I'm going to lay out all the data for you. I'm going to tell you why I think the way I think. You can agree with me and think that way. You can tell me I'm full of S and think something else. I accept either way. What I'm here to do is tell you, here's all the data that I took in. Here's how I critically analyzed that data in my expert opinion as an expert in the field. And here's the conclusions I came to. But I'm more than welcome for you to come to your own conclusions. And if you come to conclusions different than mine, let's have a discussion and figure out why we came to those different conclusions. They were absolutely refreshed to see that. They love that because that respects them enough to say that, look, I think that you have the knowledge basis. I think you have the critical analysis to look at all of the data and come to your own conclusion. I'm not here to try to control the information that you see. What I'm going to try to teach you is you should be most fearful of the people that are trying to control the information. And you should be most, looking towards the people that are giving you all the information, because it's those people that respect you enough that you can come to your own decision. Even if our decisions are different, I can argue with you why I came to my decision. You can argue with me why you came to your decision. But let's look at all the data together rather than looking at only the side that, for example, the climate alarmists want to show you, because they have a narrative that they're pushing. And that narrative, the figures and the graphs and the data is structured to fit that narrative. If you take a step back and you look at it a little more holistically, it becomes a little more difficult to make the arguments that we are in some sort of environmental or climate crisis. And that's what I tried to let them know. And I think they appreciated it. I think that they appreciated it when I was giving them these talks on TikTok. TikTok shadow banned me, though, because obviously they didn't like this type of information getting out. But I think if the students were exposed to this type of information, they found it very refreshing. They were very open to it. They were very refreshed by hearing this type of information.
Yeah, but I mean, this pretty much does not only sum up the state of academic freedom nowadays, but also, as you mentioned, being shadow banned by TikTok. It's also kind of an example of what the societies are facing with not only academic freedom, but in regards of freedom of expression as well. And in the United States, there is more protection, at least constitutional protection for freedom of speech. In Europe, for example, it is easier for the powers that be to put pressure on social networks, even easier, although in the United States there are, COVID times, there were examples that how the government was censoring speech via Twitter, for example. So why is it so? What do you think? What is the goal? Let's talk about climate change. What is the goal or the end game here? Why is the debate censored that much?
I mean, the simple answer is money.
Oh.
And, that's unfortunately cynical, but that's the truth. There's a ton of money that is pushing. There's a lot of incentives. So remember the IPCC. This is essentially a policy institute. This is a governmental institution there's a policy think tank. They're pushing certain policy, and so in order to push the policies that they need the data to fit. And one of the easiest ways to make the data fit is to control the funding institutions, control the publishing institutions, and control the academics, right? And then so if you can control those three things, then you're essentially controlling information. And then it doesn't matter really what the data says, because you're only going to let the data that fits your narrative get out there. And that's the unfortunate part when science gets politicized. I think we saw that with COVID. That was a rapid politicization of science, and we're seeing it with climate change. Climate change is a little bit more slow-moving politicization of climate of science, but it is absolutely the politicization of science, and it's the manufacturing of a consensus. So if you try to push one side of the debate out, or you destroy their reputation. So the moment I started speaking up about some of these things, there was a Media Matters article that came out that ranks higher than my own website through Google, that calls me a right-wing heretic or something or other. There has been multiple hit pieces that were written about me within just a first month of me speaking out that rank higher than my own webpage does in a Google search. And so if you can control the information, if you can discredit anyone on the other side, whether it's their reputation, whether it's the science they put out, if you could just discredit the other side, well, then you've manufactured this consensus. And you can always see they always revert back to consensus. No matter what the data says, we're having a remarkably quiet Pacific hurricane season. In fact, it's the quietest on record. The named storm was the latest one we've ever had. And they'll say, well, but there's a scientific consensus that hurricanes will get worse under climate change, right? So you manufacture a consensus. You can essentially reject all the data now that goes against the consensus. You can paint the people that want to go against the consensus as heretics, as whack jobs with conspiracy theorists with tinfoil hats. And you can essentially now just have one narrative that is claimed to be the scientific consensus, right? The control of information is all about the imaginary consensus that one policy will save the planet. And that policy is the reduction of fossil fuels and the increase in renewables.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point I wanted to ask about. Where does the money come in? Is it the so-called energy transition, the move to renewables? That's the money part, or something else?
So that's a big part of the money part. So the money part is a huge part in the investment, right? So remember that the energy sector is one of the largest sectors in any country's economy, hands down. So radically, and transportation comes a close second a lot of times, radically transitioning and reinventing the energy and transportation sectors has a huge amount of potential for money, right? For wealth, because you're talking about some of the largest sectors in the economy. The other part comes in for government taxation. There is no process in the economy, including your bodily processes of just breathing and eating and farting, unfortunately, that doesn't produce a greenhouse gas. Mm-hmm. And so when we come to the government side, this is an ideal way to come into people's lives. What you buy, what you eat, what you drive, where you shop, the type of job you have, the type of furniture you buy, where you recreate. This is the perfect tool for government to interject itself into people's lives. And that could come in the way of control, or that could come in the way of taxation. So there's two competing forces. There's the privatization side. There's a huge market capitalization that's going on. And there's a lot of smart businessmen that know that if the governments keep pushing this, well, they're going to get giant subsidies and this stuff is going to be created, whether it helps or not. We might as well get in on this and make some money. And then there's a lot of bureaucrats and politicians that are going, wow, what a wonderful way to have policies that are involved in controlling people's lives in every aspect and in the name of saving the planet. What a better excuse to control your life than saving the planet. If we don't do this, the planet will end. We need to control every aspect of your life. So I think there's two competing forces, but the overall outcome is they're going to exaggerate climate risk because it's going to allow them to continue to either tax or get subsidies or interject themselves into your life because, again, they're saving the planet.
So it's kind of big business and big government, and I mean, if we let them merge,
and they love each other.
Yeah, if we let them merge, we get a new system, totally new system called what is it called? Corporatism, something like that.
Exactly, and remember, big government is driving the big policy a lot of times. Those two go hand in hand, right? It's not really they don't fight when you get to that big part. They don't fight anymore. They collaborate.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk a bit more about the continuing propagation of climate crisis. I mean, when you hear about it, for example, when you hear about the United Nations Secretary General speaking about the highway to climate hell, I mean, it's understandable that younger generations, they get anxious and they don't believe, or they start believing that the world is going to end. But you're actually saying that there is nothing wrong with our climate. So how can that be?
Yeah, so and I agree with you 100% that I don't blame these young people for gluing themselves to the road or throwing orange paint on a painting. I understand. I was passionate when I was a young person too, and all of the propaganda that's out there. So I don't blame them at all. I think that their heart is in the right place. They really are scared and they're trying to do the right thing. But if they took a step back and they looked at the observable data, not future projections. So remember, climate models, in my mind, are not science because the scientific method requires that I can test something. And a prediction is unfalsifiable because it's untestable. You can tell me what the climate will be in 2050, and I can say, okay, but I can't test it until we get till 2050. So I argue, let's look at the observable data. Let's look at how the 1.3, 1.2, some people say all the way up to 1.5 already of warming since 1880 that we've had. Let's look at how that has affected society. And if you look at that data, it's very difficult to find any metric which you would define the state of the planet as a crisis or an emergency or a catastrophe or anywhere near collapse, words that you will hear in the media a lot. And let me mention words that the IPCC never uses. So there's this little bit of a disconnect between the science and the media as well. But you just don't find those metrics, if you start to look at those metrics, let's talk about a few of them. Let's, for example, look at there's a database out of Brussels, the Center for the Research and the Epidemiology of Disasters. And this is a center that really looks at natural disasters primarily on like health effects and things like that, disease after things like floods or earthquakes. But what they have to do is they have to count natural disasters. In order to look at their health effects, they need to know when the natural disasters have occurred. So they have one of the best databases that we have for things like natural disasters. It's called the Emergency Database. And if you look at that, it starts all the way back from 1960 and goes all the way till today. And the emergency database system says that, hey, if you're going to look at our data, anything before 2000, you have to take with a grain of salt because we have reporting biases. We didn't really know what was happening in 1980 in the Congo when a river flooded. By the year 2000, we're pretty interconnected as a society, and I think we're getting those reports. So after the year 2000, we're confident that we're reporting every natural disaster. And then they split those natural disasters into things like meteorological, climatological, hydrological. If you look at those disasters since 2000, so that's a 24-year time span. Now, keep in mind that that 24-year time span is when CO2 increased in the atmosphere more rapidly than ever before. More CO2 was added to the atmosphere in that 24-year period than in any 24-year period prior, primarily because China has been modernizing and relying a lot on fossil fuels. What we see is that there's been a slight decrease in the number of events since 2000. And so there's just no metrics. There's no increase in extreme weather. If you look over 100 years, we've reduced the deaths associated with weather-related disasters by 96 or 98%. There's just no metric that you can look at besides CO2 is going up and the surface of the planet has warmed a little. There's no other metric that would argue that society is somehow being harmed right now by the 1.3 or whatever degrees of warming we've had since 1880. Everything would argue that we've actually benefited from the warming that has occurred thus far. But if you look at the IPCC, so this is something that I write about in my Substack as well, there's a confirmation bias in the IPCC. Their mission statement in the IPCC is that their mission is to identify the detrimental effects of climate change. And if you go out looking for something, you're going to find it. And that's not to say that there won't be some detrimental effects, but they don't talk at all about the increase in agricultural yields from CO2 fertilization, for example, or the production of synthetic fertilizers from fossil fuels in the Haber-Bosch process. Something like 4 billion people on the planet right now are being fed off of agricultural crops that are being fertilized with synthetic fertilizers that are being created from fossil fuels. So you can't just look at one side of a picture. You have to look at what are the benefits that cheap and reliable energy, synthetic fertilizers, all of the plastics that have been created, the lubricants, the oils, what are the benefits that fossil fuels have given society? And then let's weigh that against the possible detrimental effects that your models argue will happen, but haven't happened in the observable data yet. If you start to show me in the observable data that these things start to change, I will change my story and we'll have a very different conversation. But if the climate crisis only exists in the models and doesn't exist in the observable data, then I don't see any real reason to call it a crisis or an emergency or a catastrophe or whatever the word is.
Yeah. Do I understand correctly that some of these models that the IPCC is basing their statements on have been running for some time and can be already proved wrong?
So there's a lot of older models that they have a too hot model problem. So there was definitely older models that have now been rejected because actually there was a paper in Nature talking about the too hot model problem. And so they've been tweaking this. But remember, models are only as good as the assumptions that are put into them. And so we can tweak these models to give us essentially any result we want. And so I always tell people, look, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think models are useful for sure, but never will a model outweigh the observable data. You cannot convince me that the environment is in crisis or an emergency until you show me in three metrics. I talk about three metrics. I talk about severe weather occurring. I talk about the cost in insurance. We have not seen any increase. And loss of life. We have not seen any increase. In fact, we've seen a dramatic increase. And so unless you show me in those three metrics that that there's a big detrimental effect from the climate, I disagree that you can call it a crisis or an emergency.
So you mentioned that there is slight warming when you look at the time from 1880 and so on. So yes, this is probably correct. That's what they are measuring. So that's fine. But I wanted to ask from you, as a geologist who knows, basically the history of Earth very well, is it somehow alarming that, what does it mean if a temperature rises over 100 years, 1 degree or 1.5 degree? And I mean, from the history of Earth, we probably can point out conditions that really resemble more of a climate crisis than what we're experiencing now, right?
Yes, and in fact, it's actually, the answer is we don't know. Because when we look at the past and we look at reconstructions like the IPCC likes to do over the Holocene, the last 12,000 years or so, when you look at that older data, the granularity is something like 300 years, 3 centuries. So we don't really know what's happening on the century timescale. We just don't have that kind of precision when we look at the past in things like rocks or ice cores and things like that. So this is one of the reasons I argue that it's not really scientific or ethical to put modern measurements with proxy data. You'll see a lot of times proxy data like ice cores and things like that, and on that will be spliced modern measurements and you'll see a big uptick going up. I find that to be unethical scientifically because we don't know how the temperatures were changing on a 100-year time scale in the past. We just don't have that kind of sensitivity. But what we do know is that there's been huge climatic shifts with relatively little change in CO2. In fact, we've had things like the medieval warm period, where temperatures in Europe were significantly warmer than they are today. We've had things like the Little Ice Age, when temperatures were significantly colder than they are today. All of these things are occurring with relatively little change to CO2. And so if there's anything that I argue, it's we need to be resilient. We should stop pretending that if we changed or lowered our emissions that the climate would stop changing. That's the true climate denial. That's the true denial of climate right there. What we need to accept is that regardless of the CO2 in the atmosphere, we are going to have shifts, and those shifts could occur over timescales of decades or centuries, and we should be prepared. And being prepared means we need access to cheap, reliable energy. How are solar panels going to perform if we go into another little ice age in Europe? You know, so climate is going to shift. It's a fallacy to pretend that the amount of CO2 will restrict the climatic shifts of the future. We need to be prepared.
So, I mean, we also talked about before the kind of imbalance of the Western world trying to, you know, make it happen with this, I don't know, green turnaround, energy transition, and so on. And at the same time, other parts of the world, some of them, they have means to industrialize with fossil fuels, for example, China and India, and some are not so fortunate, for example, in Africa. So the kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of hypocrisy built into it. What I mean is that we can do whatever we want here, but the emissions of CO2 will still rise because China and India, and at the same time we tell, for example, Africans that you cannot use fossil fuels. So what's your perspective on that?
I think this is going to be probably the legacy of this green revolution. I call it the new green colonialism. It's unfortunately going to keep hundreds of millions of poor people in developing nations, like you mentioned, primarily in Africa, in poverty for decades longer than they ever needed to be. And this is directly from policies like Mr. Guterres under the UN, and the fact that they are essentially telling these nations that they should not develop their own resources. They should wait for these Western world saviors that are going to come and develop solar farms and wind turbines and wind farms, and they're going to save them. And that is just going to keep people in poverty for a lot longer than they need to be. If you look at Africa, there's so limited access to electricity. They're using dung and wood for cooking and heating. The health effects of that are so detrimental. Millions of them are dying from respiratory diseases that could be easily prevented by giving these people a propane bottle. A simple propane exchange would be enough, and a cooking stove, and that would be enough to save millions of lives. But the UN and the policies that they're pushing says, no, 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 no. If we give them propane bottles, it might make them breathe easier at night. It might make their health better, but it's going to increase the atmospheric CO2, and that is something we can't have. These poor people must suffer and live in poverty because we need to save the planet for our future generations. I see it's so hypocritical. It's so similar to the colonialism that occurred before, how we're taking all of these minerals. So we're switching to very mineral and energy intensive technologies like solar panels and electric vehicles. And we're taking all of these raw materials from Africa, and we're doing this in the name of saving the planet. I find it very hypocritical. I think it's a note that the young people are really noticing. I think it's really affecting them. They're really starting to realize that this is so hypocritical. I just went and got a Starbucks coffee, and now I'm gluing myself to the road, and now I'm going to go and have a vacation over in somewhere else while I fly over there. This is hypocrisy at its finest. We get to live in a society that has all the benefits of cheap and reliable energy while we look to these billions of people who are still electricity starved and tell them that no, the future of our great grandchildren is more important than the needs of you and your children today. I find it absolutely hypocritical, and I see it as probably the lasting legacy of this green revolution. It's going to be this new green colonialism. It's unfortunate because hundreds of millions of people will stay in poverty for way longer than they ever needed to be, and nothing's going to change with the weather. Yeah,
and I also would add that they are looking for the information about the same topics or any topics that interest them from their mobile phones, and then where do you get the minerals to make those mobile phones again from Africa? So yeah, the hypocrisy is written all over it. And
one other thing you mentioned, so a lot of what we've been doing in the Western world, is we've been outshoring or offshoring our CO2 emissions, right? That's why you mentioned the global CO2 emissions keep going up. Well, yeah, sure. The Europe and North America and Canada, the U.S. and Canada and even Mexico, we pat ourselves on the back and we say, look, we've lowered our CO2 emissions by this much. But all we've done is essentially offshored that industry to China and India. They do it dirtier. They have no regard for things like environmental policy. And so the global CO2 is going up faster than ever, but us over here in the Western world are patting ourselves on the back going, look at all the CO2 reduction we've done, which it just goes to show you none of this is really about CO2 or the climate.
Yeah, that's the real question, right? We talked about what is it about, but really, is it still more about consolidating power then, or why do we do it still?
It's the perfect tool. Climate is the perfect tool. I mean, it's everything, right? CO2 is everything. There's been no other aspect or no other kind of policy or trend that has allowed the government to get so involved in people's lives and have people so adamant and behind it. I mean, it's perfect, right? Usually if the government wanted to get involved in people's lives, there was a big pushback. People were out in the streets because they were like, hey, back off. But this is like the perfect thing. We're saving the planet. If it's really a planetary style problem and the planet is in trouble because of the amount of CO2, then we need a planetary government and a planetary solution. And there needs to be just a few people in charge, right? And so it's perfect if you want to centralize control.
Yeah, some people are actually talking about it, aren't they? I mean, if If you hear
the
them.
solutions to some of this stuff is worse than climate change. The ideas of blocking out the sun and things like that. I mean, I would argue that a lot of the solutions are worse than any of the warming would actually contribute.
Yeah, there are. I don't know. There is the technology that taxpayers in the U.S. at least are spending billions. That it's called direct air capture, and some billionaires are the seed funders there, and they are in line to make a lot of money again.
Yeah, it's great hearing Bill Gates say, I know I travel on my jet all over the place by myself, but I buy into the carbon capture. So I'm offsetting my carbon. Can you imagine if you came home, you're like, I know, sweetheart, I cheated on you. I know. But look, I bought into this cheating capture. So it doesn't count because I paid this guy. He's not going to cheat on his wife, but that allows me to cheat on you. So it's all good because he's not going to, no, it's okay. It's just, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's a complete waste of money too. It's like trying to empty, I wrote about this on my Substack too. It's like trying to empty the ocean one spoonful at a time. Mm-hmm. The amount that they're capturing is so minuscule. And the amount that they're spending to capture it, CO2 is the new diamonds. I mean, CO2 is the new gold, platinum, because the cost of that every ton that they're putting in is remarkable. I mean, it's what a waste of money. Yeah. Plant some trees.
Yeah, and the taxpayers are paying for it. That's the bottom line. And this is how it's done probably everywhere, because when we think about wind turbines, there is no way that the taxpayer is not going to pay for them. Solar energy, they're not effective without taxpayer money, and so on.
That's right. So I have, solar panels on my roof, but I would have never got them if there weren't subsidies. And the young people don't understand that, right? They say, oh, no, but, I saw a tweet and it said that wind power is the cheapest kind of power. I said, okay, but look, per kilowatt, the subsidies are something like 80 times what we're subsidizing natural gas. So let's pretend that we went all to wind power. Do you see that that's possibly not sustainable? Could we really produce all the power if we had to supply 80 times the subsidies for all the power? Because wind is producing something like 8% right now, and they start to understand, but they just don't get the economics, and the headlines just say, oh, renewable power is the cheapest type of power.
Yeah. So what do you think? How much honest discussion? Well, I mean, outside academic circles, in the media and so on, how much honest discussion about climate change or these energy issues there actually is? Because it's not like everything is somehow censored. You can do it, but mainstream media probably more or less ignores it and so on.
Yeah, so I think, yes, mainstream media, besides maybe Fox, will ignore it primarily. But when Elon Musk purchased X, I think that changed the discussion pretty dramatically. So there's still a lot of censorship that happens on Facebook, still a lot of censorship that happens on TikTok. But we don't see that censorship on X anymore. And so there's been a lot of healthy discussion. There's been a lot of people getting involved that really weren't involved in climate before. You see, obviously, people like Joe Rogan are talking about it, and Jordan Peterson are talking about it. And I think young people are starting to kind of be a little bit more open to some debate. They're getting a little bit fed up with kind of one side really trying to control the information. So I think the debate is still very, problematic. It tries to get squashed before it can happen. But once it starts, I think people are pretty open to it. The difficulty is kind of getting it off the ground and getting people willing, particularly on the other side. So, a lot of the folks on kind of my side are more than willing to speak up, because there's just not as much, negative consequences for my side, but then there is for academics and things like that. But I think that with people like you and other folks that are doing podcasts and having folks like me on, it's starting to change slowly. Unfortunately, the stuff that you hear in the government and the policy, you're not hearing much change at all. So
Yeah, that's a problem because, for example, we had the EU elections, EU Parliament elections back in June, and before that, the centrist conservative side, they promised to put some brakes on the climate issues, but after the election, they came out and said that the von der Leyen came out and said that we're going to continue. So basically, lies still work, and that's something problematic in my opinion. I don't know, how is it in the United States?
I think a lot of this, a lot of this is words for their base. But if you look at the actual policies or the actual, the outcomes, so I wrote about this, I compared Trump to Biden, and if you look at Trump to Biden, the fossil fuel extractions have continued under President Biden. In fact, last year there was more fossil fuel extraction in the United States than ever before. So a lot of it is lip service that he's just kind of saying because he realizes that his base probably won't go in and dig up the amount of the millions of barrels of oil that were actually extracted. So I think a lot of it is lip service. I try to, because they're just kind of appeasing to their base, even though they know they're not going to hit these targets. I think the EU kind of realizes that as well. They kind of set these targets and the young people clap and say hurrah. And then 2030 comes and we're, 30% of the way there. And then they say, no, it's going to be 2050 now. And, so I think a lot of it is just talk,
maybe it's going to be something like just a parallel, something like, I don't know if you remember that Comrade Brezhnev was going to have communism by 1980. So they're saying by 2050 we're going to have this and that. And so
that's right.
maybe there's something we can take.
Let's hope not.
Yeah, let's hope not. I mean, one of the things is that people like you who are talking about it, and even the podcasters that are interviewing people like you and so on, they are, well, some people are listening, but then there is the activist class that is instantly going to, call them names and, for example, call all the professors like William Happer and Dr. John Clauser and other renowned scientists, call them working for big oil and so on. So there's the what was it? The Canadian site that has a climate disinformation.
The Global Warming Foundation.
Database. Database.
Sintel. There's Sintel.
Yeah, I don't know if you're in there as well.
Global Warming Policy Foundation.
Yeah, but I was thinking of this webpage that started back in 2005.
Oh, DSMOG.
Oh, yeah, exactly. They have the climate disinformation database. I didn't look up if you were there, but probably you are. I mean...
I haven't looked.
Oh, yeah, maybe we can do it later. But I mean, have you experienced such attacks as well?
Yeah. So, this is, I don't blame young academics for not speaking out. You can see why someone like Dr. Happer or Dr. Clauser would speak out, Dr. Richard Lindzen. They're emeritus professors, they're retired, so they've got nothing really to lose. But the climate surrounding any of these topics, about climate change is just so toxic. I mean, it has nothing to do with exchange of ideas. It has nothing to do with trying to get to the truth. It has nothing to do with healthy debate. It is completely a politicized narrative. It's driven by the IPCC predominantly, which is really driven by policymakers and policy change, bureaucrats, politicians. And, if you go against that, you are a heretic. I've never experienced anything like it, but just, having these discussions or speaking out against the idea that we're in a climate crisis. I'm not saying that climate change isn't real. I talk about climate change all the time and talk about how human influences climate, for example, urban heat island effect. And so to call me a climate change denier is completely incorrect. But to just have any questions about the narrative, you get an enormous pushback, hundreds of calls to my chair and emails to the department. And if we're talking about the one thing that the policymakers are really using to develop the future. I mean, the future now is essentially planned with climate in mind. Every aspect of every policy decision that is made has some sort of climate angle. You would think that something so important and something so central to how we're planning every government's future economy and even social aspects, something that important would be scrutinized and should be debated. And in academics, there should be a healthy debate about this. Does the data support some of these claims? And the fact that it's not being debated, the fact that if you just question it a little, you're attacked, is clear evidence to me that the data doesn't support it. The other side knows the data doesn't support it. And the only way to continue the narrative is to try to destroy anybody that questions it.
Well, yeah, I think you might be correct on that. And I don't hope, I don't have that much hope that there will be a debate before, some politicians change their mind and start talking about maybe we're running ahead of ourselves and maybe we should do something differently. Then there will be some discussion. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, I do. I'm hopeful. I definitely think that things kind of ebb and flow. I think people had good intentions with a lot of this climate and environmental policy, but it's clear that now that we've been doing it for a while, I think we should take a healthy look at what works, what doesn't work, what is the negative mental health effects for young people with a lot of the messaging that we're pushing. So I do see a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a lot of uphill work to be done. This is something like nearly $1 trillion industry now, this whole green industry. There's a ton of money in it, and there's a lot of money in keeping the narrative exactly the way it is. And so I think it's going to be an uphill battle, but I just think people are frustrated and tired of constantly being told something that's not true, and such a negative and unhopeful message, like the planet is in trouble and you're the problem. The idea that humans are like a parasite on the planet, that's just not an idea that really tracks well with young people. They're tired of that. They don't believe that. And, it's becoming more and more clear that the climate aspect is kind of a little bit of a guise, or maybe a little bit of a Trojan horse for kind of maybe more socialist policies, and they're kind of using climate as that. And hopefully people, at least in my generation, still remember their parents' stories of the terribleness that led to. So, but I'm hopeful. I have to be hopeful. I got 7 and 9-year-old boys.
Yeah, and I hope you're correct that younger people do start to think about it the way you describe. But time flies, and it has been very interesting to talk to you and learn new aspects about this climate debate and new facts. But our time has run out for today. So thank you, Matthew, for taking the time and giving this interview.
Thank you very much. And if anybody's interested in reading more from me, they can check out irrationalfear.com.
Yes, that's your Substack. And you also have a webpage, MatthewWielicki.com.
Yep, that has a lot of my research and things like that, links to publications.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you again, Matthew. And for our fresh content, of course, visit freedomresearch.org. Thank you for watching and listening. This is it from us for today. See you soon.